Hello, everybody. So this is the discussion for week 2 readings. We're going to go over an Indigenous people's history of the United States and also decolonizing methodologies, Indigenous peoples and research. Now, first I want us to go over a couple things. Some people have asked about, for Indigenous peoples and Indigenous people's history of the United States, some people have asked about the YA version. So I wanted to quickly give you all a difference in the adult version and then the young adult version. So the young adult version here, the differences in the two books are chapters 1 through 5 and 7 are the same for both the young adult and the adult version. Chapter 6 and then 8 through 10 and the conclusion are different. They're named differently. And the adult version has a chapter about the doctrine of discovery. So those are the big differences within the two. The young adults version also has more pictures. So just wanted to say that from the... So in an Indigenous Peoples History of U.S. history, Dunbar starts off on page 2 saying, U.S. history from an Indigenous people's perspective requires rethinking the consensual national narrative. So the reason I offered these readings in the beginning is because before we jump to U.S. education history, we have to think about how we think about history and who is writing history and who decides what history becomes the national narrative. So Dunbar states this and then goes on to talk about, right above that, history of the U.S. is a history of settler colonialization. So that's what I want to take a couple minutes to talk about, is settler colonialization, because I think it's important as we talk about decolonizing and unlearning, understanding what settler colonialism is and what it does. And Dunbar and Ortiz talks a little bit about that with this idea of the doctrine of discovery. So we know about this Columbus myth. And keeping in mind, for those of you that have the adult version, there's a whole chapter on the doctrine of discovery, which is chapter 11. So Dunbar Ortiz talks about this independence that we have as a country and this independence narrative. And with that independence comes the erasing of other people. So the physical erasing of folks as Columbus was paid to come over. Also understanding that there was people here stewarding the land prior to Columbus finding something that was already found and here. Also understanding that in this national narrative, it's not shared that Columbus, the Tanos people, were the first ones that came in contact with Columbus, which the indigenous folks of what is now today Puerto Rico. So we don't, that when we talk about the national narrative, those are the things that are erased and aren't discussed. It's like, oh, Columbus discovered America. And the comeback to that, particularly in indigenous communities, is how can you discover something that's already there? So again, I want us to talk about settler colonialization and get into some of the tenets or concepts of settler colonialization. So Dunbar Ortiz talks about this on page 6 and 7. This idea that settler colonialism is not in the past. It still persists today. So Dunbar Ortiz talks about this on page 7, but also on page 40, where she talks about the erasure of people, which is the first tenet of settler colonialism that we'll talk about. So we know that this expansion westward, as people are removed, but then also on the eastern coast, there were indigenous folks already there, and they're moved out west, or they're moved to other territories, and that's where we see treaties starting to happen. But for this settler colonial agenda to happen, this first tenet of erasing and removing people was important to them. The second tenet of settler colonialism, and we find this more, Dunbar talks about this a lot on page 35, where we look at land as commodity and the privatization of land. So we have individuals that are already stewarding the land, but we have to erase them, remove them, and then land is put up as private property. So then it starts to be, sectioned off and sold. So that's the second tenet or another tenet of settler colonialism. So the next tenet to be reminded of is this extraction of resources. Dunbar Ortiz talks about this on page 43. And this extraction of resources is natural resources, but then also that includes people. And we see that in folks being brought over from Africa to be enslaved for the use of other people and to be property. But then we also see that in, again, that movement of indigenous folks who were already here. And as we look at the expansion of the United States, that had to be removed. And a lot of times because they knew that there was natural resources on those lands. So not only extracting the people of the land, but extracting the natural resources of that land as well. So those are the tenets that I pull out from what Dunbar Ortiz has in chapters 1 and 2. And I will link another reading that is available. If you just Google the title of the reading, you'll be able to find a free copy of that. It's called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, which goes in more detail about the tenets or the concepts of settler colonialism. So again, I'll put that in the description box. Next, Dunbar Ortiz also talks about the development of race. Like, she may not use those words, but she talks about whiteness and white supremacy. And so within my own research, I talk about the development of race and racialization. So making these categories to say, you're this race, and then we have white supremacy, which says, the white race is on top or supreme to everyone. And then what also comes from that is this idea of racial hierarchy. So which races are more important? And so we see that come into play when we think about, and there's disciplines that have perpetuated this. And we see it in anthropology, how anthropologists discuss particularly indigenous communities, but diverse communities. We also see this in history, how historians have talked about different races. We also see this in science, like we have Darwin, who was trying to show that biologically there are individuals who have less intelligence, that have smaller brains, that are able to do different things. So we have science, history, and anthropology, just to name a few, that are perpetuating this myth that this literally man-made idea of race and racialization. We have these other disciplines at the beginning of the start of the United States, what we now know as the United States, who are feeding into this idea that there's a racial hierarchy, and that one race is superior to another. So lastly, I want to talk about this idea that Dunbar brings up very briefly called manifest destiny. So this is a picture that is always, that's called Manifest Destiny. And I'll put the author or the original painter of this in the comments box. There's also a short video that I show my students and I think it could work for any ages it's really like a 2 or 3 minute video that discusses manifest destiny. So there's this idea of, the Christian Crusaders have come over and they're saying that it's by destiny, it's God's destiny that they move westward and make the Indian savages more civilized. And so we have this idea of manifest destiny. And this picture, if you notice the contrast of the dark, where we're looking at where they're moving into Indian territory and where the indigenous stewards are of the land. And then you have this lighter side. So there's even this binary of white, meaning pure, and Dunbar Ortiz talks about that. White meaning pure and holy, and then you have this darker side. So they're moving this white side essentially into this darker side. And what that visualization means for individuals at that time and how they're thinking about this idea of manifest destiny, and thinking that Christianity, moving it in, is going to make this a brighter and lighter and more holy space. Hello, so now we're going to talk about decolonizing methodologies, research, and indigenous people. So keep in mind, I am coming from the the second edition, and there are other editions. Of course, the third edition will be newer. So the pages, if you have an older or newer edition, they may not match the pages that I talk about or discuss, but the information is still there. It may be a couple pages ahead or a couple pages after the page that I say. So just keep that in mind. So Toowa Smith discusses that decolonization is imperialism and colonization at different levels. So how I interpret this in my work is that within history of education, again, I'm an education historian, what I see a lot of times in the archives and in the conversations and in textbooks or kind of canons that we are expected to read is that history of education in the United States is often white history of education. And there's also these ideas that I found in the archives that it's either all white history or then it jumps to desegregation history. And then you start to talk about white and black history, which is a lot of what the archives discuss. And there's no conversation about what was happening during segregation for black schools, for indigenous schools, for Mexican American schools. So all of these other populations of people are left out in these conversations. So part of what I hope to do, and Toowa Smith on page 36 discusses coming to know that decolonization is about coming to know the past and reclaiming the past and giving testimony to the injustices. So that's what I do in my research, because in this history of education, we also don't hear about settler colonialization and the impacts that it had for the development of education and the development of schools in the United States, which also impacts the curriculum that is developed for schools in the early history of education. So in this, talking about coming to know the past, Toowa Smith discusses that the places where it's important to understand how decolonization and coming to know the past are important is in the history of imperialism in the United States. I should say, let me pause for a minute. I'm saying within the United States, but Dr. Toowa Smith is actually from New Zealand. So this is within her context in New Zealand, but we see it in imperialistic societies, which the United States is one of those. So although she's writing in that New Zealand context, we're also seeing that in the United States. So within that, decolonizing and coming to know the past, she discusses that seeing those re-examining and reclaiming that history is important in imperialism, in history, in writing, and in theory. So Toowa Smith discusses this on page 22 as she talks about the importance of control when it came to imperialization and exploitation, which we see and we've discussed before, that in the example that she gives is that Columbus is given money to go explore and extort and exploit whatever is found in these areas where, again, he's given money to say, oh, I'm going to go explore and discover things, although things are already there and have been discovered. But this idea that he's given this money to go, that's his charge, is to go and look for these places. And then the subjectification of other individuals. So we look at the domination over indigenous peoples and also indigenous and African individuals who were brought over to the United States and then enslaved and set as property for other people. This idea of control was also shown in how history is shared about indigenous people, whether they've been erased or that how they're discussed in history. And it's often told through a white lens. And again, this idea that Toowa Smith is saying that history, reclaiming this history, is so important for indigenous scholars and for the United States as a whole. Tua Smith also discusses the misconceptions of history, which are found on page 31 through 34. But one thing I wanted to point out is on page 33, she says, history was the story of people who were regarded as fully human. So again, this conversation and why we're having this first is to get to thinking about how history has been told, who we think of that is able to tell history, and whose history that we see as important. And again, I see this in the archives when I see whose history is being discussed, whose narratives are being shared, and particularly with Indigenous history of education, we see that the idea is that we need to, these are uncivilized people. This is how they're talking about Indigenous populations. These are uncivilized people, and they need to be saved. And it's the same conversations that are had with Black individuals as they're developing schools. These are individuals who are not smart, and we need to give them all the knowledge that we have, is what the white narrative is saying, and the historical narrative of we need to educate these individuals and tell them what they need to know. Tua Smith goes on to say on page 35, history is about power. In fact, history is mostly about power. It is a story of the powerful and how they became powerful, and then how they use their power to keep them in positions in which they can continue to dominate others. So from that, thinking about what history does and how it has historically, also thinking about writing and theory and the ways that it opens up history and storytelling for Indigenous peoples. Because history, theory, and writing have been used to write about us versus with us, and that is what Tua Smith is calling Indigenous scholars to do. And I would say is calling all of us that are reading her work and thinking about how we think about history, she's calling us to do that work. So Tua Smith is opening up that space for Indigenous people to write about our own stories and our histories. But I would also say that she's encouraging us as consumers of history to go beyond what we usually do of just consuming that history and not asking, whose history is this? Who has written this history? And some tangible ways to go about that is to, first of all, research the individual, research the authors that you're reading about, and how are they positioned in the communities? Are they positioned in the communities that they're writing about and that they're doing this historical work about? And that really goes for any type of research. So I hope this discussion has been helpful. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, and then you can click those notifications so you also get a notification when I upload the video. And let me know about your comments, any additional things you want to talk about in the comments, and I look forward to hearing from you all. Have a good day.